6 years ago, it was supposed to be a normal day, just like any other. But for her, it would be the day her routine would change forever. She had always enjoyed her walks around the city, taking in the sights, getting her steps in, and clearing her mind. Every day, she would leave the house, usually around noon, and follow her usual route. She would stay out for a few hours, maybe a little longer, before heading back home. But this particular day, this day was different. She had a lot to do, chores to finish, mistakes to fix. It wasn't until late afternoon that she finally found herself ready to go. She looked at her watch and saw that it was almost 3 p.m., but she usually left around 11 a.m. until 2 p.m. at the latest. She hesitated, weighing her options. She had nothing else on her agenda for the next day, but she wasn't going to let a day go by without following her routine. Maybe I'll cut it short, she told herself, staring out the window at the faint orange glow that still lingered from the setting sun. She didn't want to be out after dark. She quickly slipped on her sneakers, grabbed her jacket, and headed out the door. Hours passed as she walked down the familiar streets, the kind of streets she'd seen countless times before. Her pace was steady, and she was lost in the rhythm of her walk, thoughts drifting in and out of her mind. She checked her phone and saw that it was almost 6 p.m. time to go home. She looked around, the day growing darker by the minute. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, and the cold was beginning to set in. Night was swallowing the sky whole, and she had at least a 6-mile walk ahead of her. She quickened her pace, determined to get home before the cold set in completely. With each step, the streetlights flickered, casting long shadows along the sidewalk. The streets were empty now, quieter. About 2 miles from home, she thought she was in the clear, but she was wrong. As she passed a convenience store, she noticed a man sitting on the side of the building. He looked to be in his early 30s, dressed in all black, a hoodie, pants, shoes, just blending into the shadows. He sat there, smoking a cigarette, his head tilted slightly as he turned to look at her. His eyes were strange. She couldn't see much of his face, but she felt that uneasy feeling creep up her spine. She tried to ignore it. Maybe he was just waiting for a ride. Maybe he was waiting for someone to leave the store. She looked away, deciding not to think about it anymore. But then, she noticed something strange. When she turned around, he was standing, shifting his position, and walking in the same direction as her. Her stomach clenched. It wasn't just that he was walking the same way. It was that he was walking right behind her. Her heart raced, but she tried to stay calm. Maybe he was just following the same path. Maybe he was just minding his own business like her. She kept walking, but found herself looking back every few steps to see if he was still there. And he was. She was approaching a crosswalk when he called out, "Hey!" His voice cut through the silence immediately. It wasn't a casual greeting. It wasn't a hi or a "how are you?" It was insistent, forceful, like he needed something from her. She ignored him, trying to keep walking with purpose. But it wasn't enough. "Hey!" He shouted again, this time his voice rising in anger. She could feel the tension in his words, the pressure building in the air around them. A few more steps. She kept walking, trying to keep her cool. Maybe he would just go away if she ignored him long enough. But then he came, louder, angrier. He shouted, "What the fuck?" Her heart skipped a beat. She picked up her pace, her legs moving faster but her mind racing even faster. She quickly texted her dad and explained that there was a creepy guy following her and how he was yelling at her. She could almost feel his every move as he closed the distance between them. She had to get out of here. She couldn't keep walking like nothing was wrong. Her instincts were screaming at her now, telling her that this was no longer a routine walk. Something was wrong. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. It was a text from her dad asking how far she was. She said it was less than a mile away, trying to sound calm yet scared. His reply came almost immediately, telling her to keep walking and not to worry. He would come get her soon. She looked back. The man was still there, still following her, still looking at her. The tension in her chest grew. She picked up her pace again, feeling the weight of each step. Her breathing was getting heavier. Her phone vibrated again. Her father asked her how far she was, and she replied that she was less than a mile away, asking her father to come soon. But her father's text gave her no peace. As she approached the final curve towards her street, she hesitated. Something told her not to go there yet. Something told her to keep going. She decided to ignore the instinct to turn home and texted her father that she had turned onto the other street, and he quickly replied, telling her to keep going. And then, just as she rounded the curve, something happened that made her blood run cold. She heard the sound of frantic footsteps behind her. It was the man. He had pulled his hood up and was running straight towards her. The moment she realized he was running toward her, panic surged like electricity. Her body moved before her mind could fully comprehend what was happening. She took off. Her legs carried her faster than she thought possible, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts as she pushed forward, each step seeming to close the distance between them. The street stretched endlessly before her, but she didn't dare stop or look back. She was running on pure instinct now, driven by a primal need to survive. Her only thought was to get away, to get as far away from him as possible. The cold air hit her face, but she barely noticed. The adrenaline pumping through her veins kept her warm, kept her moving. The streetlights were already on as she ran, hoping, praying that he would give up. And then, just when she thought she couldn't run any further, she saw a car. Its headlights were on, heading straight down the street toward her. She waved her arms wildly, desperation evident in every frantic movement, and she whispered softly for the car to stop. The car slowed. Relief flooded her as she recognized the familiar silhouette behind the wheel. It was her father. She didn't even look back as she ran straight to the car, throwing open the door and throwing herself inside. She slammed the door shut, locking it with shaking hands, and managed a breath, her voice tight with fear. Her father wasn't asking questions, not yet. He stepped on the gas and the car sped down the street. Only then did she allow herself to look back. But what she saw made her stomach churn. He was gone. The man who had been chasing her, who had been so close to her, was nowhere to be seen. The street behind them was empty, eerily empty. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. She couldn't explain it. One second he was there, and the next, nothing. She told her father everything as they drove. Every detail came rushing out of her. The convenience store, the screams, the chase. Her voice cracked as she described the moment she realized he was chasing her. Her father's jaw clenched, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Then he said he would come back in his firm tone, and that he would find him if he was still there. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him it wasn't worth the risk, but the words stuck in her throat. They drove slowly, the headlights illuminating every shadow and corner. Her father scanned the sidewalks, the alleys, the bushes, anywhere a person might be hiding, but there was no one. The street was silent, empty. It was almost too quiet. The man had disappeared without a trace. She never went for a walk again after that day, not in the late afternoon, not in the early evening, not after 2 p.m. The fear was buried deep inside her, a constant reminder of what could have happened. She began carrying a pocket knife with her wherever she went, a small comfort against the unknown. She knew she might never need it, but just having it in her pocket made her feel a little safer. But the question that haunted her most wasn't about what had happened. It was about what hadn't happened. What would he have done if he had caught her? That thought kept her awake at night, long after the shadows of day had faded. She didn't want to know the answer, but it lingered in her mind anyway, a dark, unshakable presence. And then there was the other question, the one that chilled her even more. Where had he gone? She never saw him again. But that didn't mean he wasn't out there. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she knew he might be waiting, watching, lurking in the shadows of another unsuspecting night. The memory of that night stayed with her, a constant reminder of how quickly the mundane can turn into a nightmare. And when she looked back, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had narrowly escaped something far worse than she could have imagined.